So India can't afford to be caught napping in the neighborhood. Violence in a country like Bangladesh with the seeds of possible further violence, I don't think anyone actually wins. India cannot ask a neighbor to be more democratic and less authoritarian unless it's willing to walk that talk itself.
I'm in conversation with Suhasini Haidar. She's a seasoned journalist with over 2 decades of experience. As the diplomatic editor at The Hindu, she has written and reported extensively on geopolitical issues, including security, diplomacy, and regional tensions. In this conversation with Brut, we'll focus on the current crisis in Bangladesh. Suhasini, thank you so much for speaking to Brut.
Thank you. Thank you, Mehek, for having me on the show.
So Hasini, like we were talking about, we have a young audience, and I'd like you to weigh in on if you could take us through the key events that led to Sheikh Hasina's exit as the former Prime Minister of Bangladesh.
Sure, Meg. And the truth is that this is a very complex history. Sheikh Hasina herself has a very complex history with her own country. She didn't just lose her father, who was the founder of Bangladesh 50 years ago, 49 years ago. She lost more than a dozen members of her family, her mother, her brothers, and all the rest in that. Even so, Sheikh Hasina was in exile before. And then she came back to power, first in 1996 and then in 2008. So what we've been seeing now is that for the last 15 years, Sheikh Hasina has been in power in Bangladesh. She has been virtually the only leader there. Because over time, all the opposition was either put in jail or was in exile. And while she has been criticized for this very high-handed sort of behavior, authoritarian behavior in the Bangladesh context, she has also been lauded around the world. She is a prime minister who really appealed to Bangladesh's youth. She brought in what is seen as an economic miracle in a country like Bangladesh. She brought in manufacturing, she brought in connectivity, infrastructure, investment. She was one of the few leaders who was able to keep both India and China really working very closely with both those countries. And she was somebody who was looked up to, as I said, with this ideal of the birth of Bangladesh so closely connected with her. So what has happened in the last few months somehow is connected to all of those things. So the first is that there has been unhappiness with Sheikh Hasina, as I said, because even though people may have overlooked the authoritarianism or the crackdown on the media or the crackdown on opposition in the past, because the economic situation was doing so well. Post-COVID and post the Ukraine war and the run on things like food, fuel, and security, the Bangladeshi economy has seen a downturn. The growth rates are lower. We've seen inflation go up. Foreign exchange is much less. It's going down, in fact. And the levels of investment in Bangladesh were not what they used to be. So there's been an increase in the joblessness. And we've seen figures as high sometimes as 30 to 40% in various categories of youth being unemployed. So this is an underlying cause for a lot of the discontent, that even though there may have been concerns about democracy in the past, it's only in the last few months or so that those have increased. They increased further because in January, Sheikh Hasina held an election in which she was virtually the only party going into the polls. The BNP, which is the main opposition party, and in the past it was always Sheikh Hasina's Awami League or the BNP, which was headed by Khaleda Zia, former prime minister. And they would always fight with each other. But for the last few elections, for one reason or the other, either the BNP has boycotted or has been banned, or its leaders have been in jail and can't take part, or in this case, they wanted Sheikh Hasina to hand over to a caretaker government, so they didn't take part. So the BNP, which is the main opposition, was outside parliament. It was virtually Sheikh Hasina's show all the way. When you have an election like that, which is contested, even though India has not made any statements about it, India welcomed Sheikh Hasina as soon as she was elected, other countries did make a lot of noises. The US even imposed sanctions on officials they said were in some way trying to subvert the electoral process. To cut a long story short, this all came to a head for a very, very different reason on July the 1st. Since independence of Bangladesh, and that's why I gave this long context, since the independence of Bangladesh, there's always been a special mention, at least especially in Sheikh Hasina's case, of freedom fighters, those who took part in the 1971 Bangladeshi liberation from Pakistan, the Mukti Bahinis, the Mukti Jodhas as they were called. And the government always gave them a sort of special status. At one point, they were given as much as 30% of the quotas in government jobs. And maybe in the past, it wasn't such a big problem simply because there were so many freedom fighters that needed to be kept inside the government. But over time, that quota has been passed on to the children and even the grandchildren of those freedom fighters. And that has been leading to an increasing amount of unrest, particularly amongst young students. And Bangladesh is the 8th largest population in the world. It's a young, burgeoning population there. And so they were objecting to this quota for some time. In 2018, we saw some fairly strong protests. But at that time, the quota was taken back by the government. And the government said, in which case there will be no quotas at all. On July the 1st, the Supreme Court decided, very unexpectedly, to say, actually, the quotas are all back. The government's decision is not going to go through. And that brought students out on the streets. On their own, it was a students' movement, and we saw protests every day. They were growing, at which point the government of Sheikh Hasina decided to crack down on them. Sheikh Hasina herself called many of the protesters razakars, or what is the word from the 1971 war for traitors, those who were with Pakistan at the time. And this upset the crowd much further. After that, what we saw was by, I think it was July 24th or 25th, the appellate court of the Supreme Court decided to take back the order once again, brought down that quota to 5%. So in a sense, Sheikh Hasina had given in, because even the Supreme Court was rumored to really be working with Sheikh Hasina because she was such a strong leader there. So in a sense, the government had given in. They had accepted the students' demands. But the protests continued. And this is very important, because this is where a lot of the conspiracy theories come in about why the protests still continued to be so violent, why they came out on the streets for what they called a non-cooperation movement on Friday that just quickly went out of control. If in the first round, about 200, 300 protesters were killed, officially that's the figure we were given, in just a day or two, we saw more than 100 being killed in those protests. And that was the final spark, if you like, after which it looked like crowds were going to reach Sheikh Hasina's own house and she had to flee.
Thank you for that, Suhasini, of taking a very complex run up to what we are seeing and condensing it for our viewers. Who would have the most to gain, when we look at it from a foreign policy perspective, a foreign hand conspiracy perspective? Who would have the most to gain at this point in time with Sheikh Hasina's exit happening?
I can answer the other question much easier, which is who would have the most to lose outside of Bangladesh? And I think that's definitely India. Sheikh Hasina has been a traditional friend of India's. When she came to power in 2007, 2008, one of her first acts was to move to shut down all terror camps. You may not remember this, Mehak, but before 2007, Bangladesh was one of the least trusted countries in India. If India had a problem with terrorism, it wasn't just Pakistan. In fact, in many cases, it was more with Bangladesh because of the porous nature of the border than it was with even Pakistan. And Sheikh Hasina turned that around. Within a few years, she had shut down all terror camps. She handed over 23 of India's most wanted for various terrorism acts. And she had also cracked down inside her own country on radicalization, on any kind of jihadist groups. And this was part of how she was able to bring business in, investment in, and all the rest of that. So she has been seen as a steadfast friend of India's. After we saw so many new infrastructure projects between the two in the last few years, after we saw Sheikh Hasina virtually, standing lockstep with India on a number of issues. There were some issues that made her unpopular within Bangladesh. For example, the Citizenship Amendment Act that had seen so many protests in India and which had really spoken about the condition of minorities in Bangladesh. Even though there were protests within Bangladesh, when Prime Minister Modi went there, I think 12 protesters were killed in police firing. Sheikh Hasina stuck by the Modi government and consistently said, this is an internal matter of India. So there has been a very close bond between the two governments, the Modi government and the Hasina government, also previously with other Indian governments. And as a result, India obviously loses a friend in the neighborhood. Who has the most to gain, therefore? I think I definitely say that Bangladesh has in the last few years got caught in geopolitical rivalry between US and China. And this is very obvious because China has a lot of investments in Bangladesh, more than India, in fact, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of oil fields, in terms of railways that they are building over there, and in terms of their connections with the Bangladeshi military. It would seem that, China has actually had good relations with Sheikh Hasina, but it stands to even gain in this situation. The US, on the other hand, has had a very bad relationship with the Hasina government. They have consistently criticized Hasina for many policies, including her policy to really crack down on those responsible for some of the, what she called war crimes in 1971. They've been very critical on the human rights question. As I said, they were very critical. The US State Department, statement after statement, sanctions about the Bangladesh elections as well. So clearly the US is making it clear they're happy with Hasina having to leave. In a very, in a sense, uncharacteristic statement, the US said that, we welcome the decision of this new interim government. We hope that they will go for election soon, because right now we're still not quite sure where this is going to lead, whether the army will take over, whether the interim government will be able to stabilize, and whether Bangladesh can have a fresh set of elections and who will be allowed to take part in that. So the US has shown that it is actually quite okay with the turn of events over there. And then, of course, in the background, there's Pakistan. And, the fact that Sheikh Hasina has always taken a very tough position on Pakistan. For many years, they didn't even have ambassadors in each other's country. Sheikh Hasina has been tough on the terror issue as well, on the radicalization issue. She'd accused Pakistan of fomenting violence in Bangladesh through various mosques and various Islamic centers. And the fact is that, for Pakistan, it's always been a wound that Bangladesh separated from them in 1971. So we have looked at Twitter and we have seen a lot of Pakistani journalists talking about this idea that, in some ways, Pakistan feels vindicated with the removal of Prime Minister Hasina. However, that would be a very short-sighted kind of view. Eventually, with violence in a country like Bangladesh, with the seeds of possible further violence, I don't think anyone actually wins.
Right. So, Hasini, what do you think are the consequences for India as with this destabilization of Bangladesh? And there's another thread to that I wanted to ask you. With the current neighbor situation with China, developing new issues with Nepal, Pakistan, we've seen, of course, in the throes of an economic crisis, Sri Lanka having its, again, economic ups and downs. What does this mean geopolitically for India in the coming few years? What are some of the things that India is going to sort of have to ramp up or watch out for?
I think that's a very, very important question. To begin with, the idea that in the neighborhood, India has had a few years of a lot of surprises, and not very nice surprises. If you were to just take a step back and look from 2021 to Afghanistan and the Taliban taking over, and President Ghani, who was very close to the Modi government, to India, having to flee the country. And you take an arc that draws you across to Myanmar, where the Aung San Suu Kyi government was ousted by the Myanmar junta, or you go to the Maldives more recently, where a government of President Soli, who was so close to India, was accused of being, so close that the movement against him was called the India Out campaign. He was voted out. The new president, Muiz, has got a relationship with India, but he's been pretty tough as well. He insisted that Indian soldiers must be withdrawn from the islands immediately. And after a few months, India agreed to that. To Sri Lanka, where India had started dealing with the Rajapaksa government to see then President Gotabaya Rajapaksa fleeing the country. And in Nepal, we've seen, governments seen as close to India being voted out or their coalitions falling apart. So there have been a lot of nasty surprises in the region. And it's certainly the case with Sheikh Hasina having to leave position. That for India, that's perhaps the largest nasty surprise, because Bangladesh is such a close partner, and Sheikh Hasina in particular. Even so, I think there's a pragmatism within the Indian system, which shows that India is able to deal with governments even beyond one particular government, one particular party, and one particular leader. So you have seen India making some kind of peace with the Taliban, or making peace with whoever's in power in Nepal or Sri Lanka or Maldives, and probably will also try to reach out to whoever does take charge in Bangladesh, because as you pointed out, the stable Bangladesh, a peaceful Bangladesh, is really very much in India's interest. Many people don't realize that the combined boundary that Bangladesh has with India is greater than its other neighbors. And it's on so many fronts. There's West Bengal, there's Assam, there's all the northeastern states as well, that all border Bangladesh. So any kind of unrest over there, any kind of violence that forces people to flee is going to directly impact India, apart from all the trade and connectivity that was really coming into its own in the last few years. So I do think that India has to reconsider what this means, what it means for its position in the neighborhood. Maybe there are some lessons learned as well, as to not being caught off guard all the time. India can't afford to be surprised in its own neighborhood. This is supposed to be our zone, in a sense. This is neighborhood first. They're all supposed to be so close to India that we should know what's going on over there. And we should have our ear to the ground, even when some of the leaders don't. So India can't afford to be caught napping in the neighborhood, because at the end of the day, you can aim for the stars, but eventually people will judge you by how well you are integrated and are able to lead and have stakeholdership in the region.
Do you think that's happened with India here? Has India been caught napping a little bit with what happened, how quickly everything unfolded in Bangladesh?
Well, without sounding, I have to ask, how is it possible that India only put out an advisory on Sunday and did not see the kind of violence that was coming, even though there'd been one round already, even though India had already evacuated 7,000 students last month when colleges were closed in the unrest, that we did not issue the advisory before Sunday night. Second, the fact that Prime Minister Hasina, and we are speaking now, and events will overtake our conversation for sure, because it's all playing out right now. But we do know that Sheikh Hasina took off from Dhaka around 2:33 in the afternoon on Monday. It is now that about 24 hours later on Tuesday, and we still don't know where she is headed. This means that the preparation for what Sheikh Hasina would do was really not complete. The fact that she has come, and she's not come into India, not come into Delhi. She is there at the Hindon Air Base on the outskirts of the capital, implies that Delhi is not her final destination. There was another country, that country is believed to be the United Kingdom, where she had applied for asylum, but it looks like the UK is diffident, is hesitant to give that asylum for a number of reasons. There may be other countries like in Europe, like Finland, where she could go. She does have a son who's based in the US as well, although it's doubted whether she would want to go there. So the question is that if Sheikh Hasina was fleeing to India, then she would have straight away come to Delhi, and her daughter does live in Delhi. She's based here as the regional coordinator of the WHO, the World Health Organization. But obviously that was not the plan. If that was not the plan, it cannot be the plan that India wants her to stay indefinitely at an airbase in a safe house over there. So obviously things are temporary and things will change. But the fact that for 24 hours there's been no movement on this, on her, on where she should be going, seems to indicate that someone certainly did not do the planning that was required, whether that's all on Hasina's government or some of it also on a close friend like India, that remains to be seen.
Right. I'm down to my last two questions. The second last one is, are there any political learnings, for India from what has unfolded in Bangladesh? Of course, on, like you're saying, on Twitter, on, in newsrooms and otherwise as well, people are talking about, students' dissent. There are a lot of common threads in terms of, activists out there, foreign hands. So are there any, on how dissent should be handled? Are there any lessons in there?
The truth is that India is bound with its neighbors geographically. There's no way that we can consistently say that we are different from our neighbors. And therefore, what happens in India will have a spillover effect amongst our neighborhood. What happens in our neighborhood will have a spillover effect here. Another thing I will point out is that India is a country that has always been looked up to in the neighborhood. It's so much larger than all its neighbors, including Pakistan, that in a sense, India has always been a country that has been aspirational in a sense. When I travel in the neighborhood, I've always been struck by how neighbors, even if they don't have the same in their country, are impressed with how India has maintained its secular outlook, how India has maintained a democratic outlook, how India is tolerant, it's pluralistic, it's rule-abiding. So there has always been a lot of admiration for what India is. Now, I'm not saying anything that has not been said 1,000 times before, but India has seen a crisis in these values in the last few years and last decade or so. And the point is very simply that India cannot ask a neighbor to be more democratic and less authoritarian unless it's willing to walk that talk itself. It can't ask Sheikh Hasina not to crack down on protesters, not to call all protesters, part of an international conspiracy, if the government of the day is doing the same to CAA protesters, agricultural protesters, and all the rest. And similarly, expect a country in its neighborhood where there are many religions and countries that have very strong majorities. It cannot expect those countries to treat its minorities well unless India is also treating its minorities well. So I think the second big learning is really that your neighbors will do as you do and not as you say. You can't just force them to take up values unless you are yourself following those values. I think the third big learning is to treat every neighbor, firstly as an equal, but also ensure that you are in touch with all parts of their stakeholders. In other words, it is not a good idea for India to put all its eggs in one basket and only be attached or aligned to one political outcome in that country and say every other outcome would be bad for us. What you spoke about, the international interference, will always be there. India is seeing it much more now. It is seeing much more US-China rivalry playing out, whether it's Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Maldives, Pakistan. You're seeing that US-China rivalry making an indent. The only way around it is for India to be the first port of call for anyone in the region, whatever party they belong to and whatever ideology they have. Unless India is the country that is seen as the leader by all, or certainly the country that will help them the most, will be the most effective partner for each of those countries, I think it's going to be very difficult. It is a fact that over the last few years, we see the idea of South Asia go away. Nobody wants to really talk about SAARC. But if we are not South Asians, or if we don't own that identity of South Asia geographically as well as politically, then what are we? Because the East Asians already have ASEAN. The Gulf has their own West Asian grouping, the GCC. Every other part of the world is breaking up into regional subgroups. And if India is going to not be able to bring together all its neighbors, and that means all its neighbors, Pakistan and Afghanistan combined, then in a sense, it is failing to actually represent the aspirations of not just 1.4 billion, but remember, as I said, there's so many of India's neighbors who look up to India that it will fail to represent them as well.
All right. Suhasini, just one last question. How do you see the echoes of what has happened in Bangladesh play out politically in India? What do you think are we going to see, and probably some ramifications of that?
I think, firstly, one must remember that whatever happens in Bangladesh, the Indian polity will stand together. There is bipartisan support for a strong Bangladesh. There's bipartisan support there has been for Sheikh Hasina. And there will be bipartisan support if they are able to see a government in Bangladesh which is not inimical to India. In other words, if the government truly represents the students' movement, the secular movement inside Bangladesh, the ideals that really brought Bangladesh into being, so long as those are valid, I think both sides of the political fence in India will be on board with that in Bangladesh. The real worries are what? The real worry is that the military takes over in a way, and we know that military regimes in the neighborhood tend to become authoritarian. They will not be, it will not be a good situation for India to border with. The second big worry is what the role of the Islamists will be in these groups. There are Jamaat-e-Islami, what is called the Chhatra Shibir, which was very, supposed to be very closely involved in the violence, which is believed to have ties still with Pakistan. How strong will they be in a new dispensation? And India has to worry about that. What will be the role of the BNP, and whether the BNP can now center itself? Because previously, when the BNP was in power, it was inimical to India. It did allow those terror camps to burgeon inside Bangladesh. But is this a new BNP that would like to mend fences with India, as they often say when we speak to BNP leaders? That's another question. Finally, and obviously, as I said, these things spill over. The question of what kind of government would come around and how it would treat the minorities in that country. Because remember, there are about, I think, 13 to 14 million Hindus in Bangladesh. And this government has certainly made it clear that they take attacks on the Hindus very seriously. And often our embassy in Dhaka has been accused of overstepping its brief by going and speaking to the Hindu groups, to the minority groups in Bangladesh, who are Bangladeshis, who have chosen to live in Bangladesh despite partition and Bangladesh's independence. So there will be a question about how that new government deals with the minority question inside Bangladesh as well. Remember, Sheikh Hasina had actually made Bangladesh a secular country again. Is that going to change? So these are very sensitive, very controversial questions. And I think for the moment, the ball is in Dhaka's court. The ball is in their court to decide what kind of dispensation the people will come around to after Sheikh Hasina has left. And I think, and Delhi will have to take its cues from that.
Right. Eloquent and candid as always. Suhasini Haidar, thank you so much for speaking to Brut.
Thank you, ma'am.